Hello, everyone. Welcome to another podcast of the Platonists. Today, we've got something that's a little bit different than our normal kind of interviews that we've been doing. So we've got our dear friend Ethan back on the show, and we're going to be talking about Platonic Epistemology today. So a little bit about things also like the TAG argument that you've probably heard about if you're in the sort of theology space at all, just the transcendental argument for God, and other kind of apologetic tactics like presuppositionalism. So that's really going to be the focus of the debate today, or not debate, discussion today. And just exploring how Platonism can interface with these ideas. Can we use some of these ideas to our own benefit? And how does that relate to sort of classical Platonism, things like our arguments for epistemology, the way that we look at the world? Are these things compatible with it? Should we be opposed to them? Where do we stand with all of that? So this is something I've been thinking about for more or less a year or so. And it really started with people like Jay Dyer. And I got kind of fascinated with the tag argument that Jay Dyer was making. And you see this from a lot of Orthodox apologists and even Protestant apologists. And it seems like that argument, to me at least, it seems like it's got something to it. I think that's what attracted me to looking into it, because I think it's easy at one level to just dismiss it out of hand and say, oh, this is stupid. They're just assuming they're correct. And then that's it. That's our whole argument, is my worldview is right and you're wrong. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized there is some value to what they're saying. And it's actually a very Platonic type of argument that they're making. But then I also think there are areas of it where they make some pretty big leaps in logic that aren't really justified. So that's kind of what I want to look into today. I think we might kick it off by looking at kind of like what presuppositionalism is, and really outlining what TAG is very specifically. And then from there, we can kind of springboard into a bit more about like Platonic epistemology, the way we think about knowledge and what knowledge really means, because that is central to the way these arguments operate, essentially. So.
Cool, yeah.
Yeah.
So
let's get into it.
I'm really interested to see the differences in the tag that you're representing as kind of like the Platonic version versus the Christian version, and going through all those differences, just because, there's definitely some non sequiturs, I think, that people recognize in the Christian presentation of the tag argument. So yeah, I'm stoked. Let's get into it.
Yeah, and I think like a broader view of this too, of like what's the point of this, has to do with Platonic apologetics, which is something I'm very interested in, and I've been getting more involved in doing debates and defending Platonism. And one thing that I've noticed in the debates I've done so far is I've found myself very often on the defense, where it's kind of like somebody has a problem with Platonism. I get involved in a debate and they're just hurling accusations at me, things about the Republic, taking some line from Proclus or Plotinus or Plato, and then, oh, look at this. And it makes for a very one-sided debate, where what I think having a framework for apologetics is really useful for is when you're in those debates, you can actually have an attack that you're going for and actually set up the debate so that you have a more of an even playing field, where there's something you're attacking just as much as they're attacking you. But, that's why something like a tag works, because it's applicable to basically everything. You're establishing your worldview, and then you've got kind of a critique for every other worldview baked into it. So I think that's super useful for us. And I think whether we adopt something similar to a tag argument or not, I think we need to have these kind of apologetic frameworks in order to become effective defenders of Platonism, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Balancing the offense with the defense.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's outline kind of what this stuff is from a high level. So it really all starts with presuppositionalism, and that's kind of baked into how the tag argument works. And I think this is one of the things that people have the biggest issue with when it comes to the tag argument is those presuppositional assumptions or presuppositions, I guess. But presuppositionalism was created by this guy Cornelius Van Til, and he wasn't orthodox. I think we've all become more aware of presuppositionalism because of orthodox apologists like Jay Dyer, but he wasn't actually one of them. I forget. Let me see if I can find out what he was. It was a type of Protestant, and I forget off the top of my head which branch of that he was a part of. But anyways, the Presup argument goes something like this. He says, first premise is that everyone reasons from their basic presuppositions. So kind of establishing like right off the bat that we're operating off presuppositions in order to do anything. And then he says the triune God's existence and Scripture's authority, those are the basic Christian presuppositions. So they argue from that framework. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Like, so far, you might look at that and go like, all right, that's all true. It's all good and well, right? And this third premise is one that actually I don't think ever gets spoken out loud when people are talking about Presup. So the third part is that sin distorts human reason such that the unregenerate mind will never accept positive demonstration. So there's a lot going on in that sentence. But what that means for them is that to be in sin is basically to not be a confessed Christian. And they're saying if you're one of those people, then you have what they call an unregenerate mind. Like you have a mind that hasn't been reborn in Christ. And so because of that, you're never going to accept the proof. Like even if you proved Christianity or whatever, they're saying, nope, you won't even be able to accept it. So I think that that's super loaded with, an assumption that they're not really justifying. I wouldn't accept that premise.
It's a nice little fail safety that they have built in there.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you don't agree with what we're saying and get it, it's due to your sin. So
yeah, it's begging the question at some level.
Right.
They're saying like, well, these people are wrong by default, and even if we're wrong, they're still wrong because they're not us. Even if our arguments didn't persuade, it's not because our arguments are bad. It's because they have this unregenerate mind and they just won't accept positive demonstration. So from that though, they're taking that as an assumption of kind of how people's minds operate. And then they say that the task of apologetics then is to expose the inconsistency of the unbeliever's presuppositions, or to show how any reasonable belief the unbeliever holds is only true on the grounds of the Christian presupposition. So that's doing a lot of heavy work too. And I think that immediately shows what we see when people are using Presup apologetics, right? Like they're not interested in necessarily proving the Christian worldview. What their goal is to say, we all have presuppositions. My presuppositions are the Christian ones. And as an attack, I'm going to show how your worldview doesn't make any sense. And if I can just show how everyone else's worldview is incoherent, then I just kind of win by default. Like, and part of that too is trying to make the argument that whatever the unbeliever believes is sort of only makes sense in Christian terms. Like the Christian presupposition is what actually grounds everybody else's belief. So you'll see these kind of arguments all the time, like basically saying that things like knowledge and intelligibility are only possible if the triune God exists, right? That's the main thing that they're going to argue. And I don't think that part of the argument holds. I think that's the weakest part of the argument. There's actually a guy on Twitter who I was listening to something the other day from him. His account's called Darwin to Jesus, and he's got some interesting like arguments for God and theism that I enjoy. But when he was talking about Presup, he actually was honest about it, and he said he's like, I don't think you can prove the Trinity using Presup. I think you can prove theism, but I think that's as far as it goes. I think it's very hard to go a step further and prove the Trinity, and I think that's exactly where this argument from Christians starts to fall apart. And we'll talk a lot about that later, I think.
Yeah.
So, so part 5, and this is where TAG really comes into play, is they say that the form of proof corresponding to the task of their apologetics is an indirect or transcendental argument. So you can see like TAG as an argument is baked into Presup. It's baked into like what the goal of Presup is and their sort of way of looking at apologetics and looking at the world even. And there's 2 other quick things that they add at the end here that goes hand in hand with some of the things before, but they say that any apologetic that seeks to reason from a common ground with an unbeliever rests faith on autonomous human reason. So, yeah. And man, there's so much going on there.
I think I'm always confused by, and we had a little discussion about this yesterday, about these kind of distinctions of reason. Like human reason, autonomous reason, and it even started out talking about sin distorting reason, which just kind of makes you wonder, well, what are we talking about then when we talk about human reason or reason itself, and how do the two compare? I think that'd be interesting to kind of tease that out, because it seems like an arbitrary distinction to me.
I think so. And, the last thing they say kind of puts that into perspective. They say that any such ground by which Christian claims are judged puts God on trial. So you can tell, like, kind of baked into that. Like, one thing that kind of opened my eyes about this is that these arguments, the way that they're kind of framing it is like in most apologetics up until Presup, the whole goal of apologetics was kind of like normal debate tactics where you're going to try to find common ground, right? You use, say, the laws of logic or whatever things that you can agree upon, and then that kind of sets the stage for you to say whether this is a valid argument, or you win the debate or lose the debate. But the point of Presup is a little different. It's actually to say that, like, you're arguing about worldviews. And that's why, like, it goes down that path of talking about things like coherence, because they're not trying to argue from neutral ground. The purpose is to, like, use those things to attack other positions, but they're not saying that those, there is a neutral ground that you can argue from. This kind of took me a while to, like, wrap my head around, but, like, basically it's saying, like, we just have these presuppositions, and the worldviews are those presuppositions, and we just need to compare which of those presuppositions makes more sense. But that's already, like, you're already kind of framing the whole world that there isn't neutral ground.
Right.
That it's like this subjective presupposition you have is actually, that's the only thing you can compare, right?
Yeah, they just start by assuming their position's infallible. Even at the end there, they say, to question this is to put God on trial because God is triune God. It's like, well, that's the thing in question here. That's the whole point of presuppositionalism, is they just presuppose that. So
right. But I think their argument to that would be, well, we all have our presuppositions. These are mine. And so, you have your own presuppositions too. So why should I accept your presuppositions before we even start the debate? I'm going to come to the debate as though Christianity is already true, and then argue from that point as though I'm right. Right.
Yeah.
And so,
and then it becomes the whole coherency thing, right?
Right. And then it slips into that.
And they use that. It's interesting because you see Jay Dyer do this all the time. He uses that coherency to attack other people's position, but when his is questioned, he turns it around and says, well, yeah, my position's circular, but there's good
vicious
circularity
and
virtuous
circularity.
And it's like, okay, well, now we have to question what's virtuous versus vicious. Like, how are you defining these? So they're very good at retreating from the holes in their argument.
Yeah, they've gotten very good at it. And like I think a lot of people have foolishly gone to debate people like Jay Dyer and other Presup people thinking like, oh, this is going to be a cakewalk. And I think they get blindsided by how sophisticated the argument really is. It's a lot. They've really worked out the kinks on it and kind of know how to navigate through it in a particular way. I really love Gnostic Informants debate. about it, because I feel like no offense to Neil at all, like I love Neil, but I feel like he didn't really get it at some point. Like he didn't really grasp like the full weight of the argument. So he just kind of like kept moving around it, and it was frustrating Jay to no end. It's not just funny. Like you can kind of play dumb to a point and just get your way out of that argument sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's generally like the Presup framework that these guys are using. And I think anybody who's looked at these debates is going to see like, okay, there's some familiarity there with how they do it. I actually think Presup is a lot of where this goes wrong, because there's just so many assumptions that are made in this argument that I don't see how it's valid at all. Like even just starting from the first one, that everyone reasons from their basic presuppositions. I'm not even sure that that's true.
Right.
When you really think about it, it's true, yeah, that people have their own subjective opinions and they make some assumptions, I guess, about the world. But is that the cause of reason? Is that where reason comes from? Is our assumptions about the world? I think right at the beginning, we're placing a lot of power in belief rather than observation, I guess.
Yeah, something outside of it, which is why their argument is so strong, because they're not really referencing anything outside of it. They're starting from the presupposition and then using that they almost like force you into it by casting presuppositions on you, and you know, like forcing you to expose your own presuppositions, because I think everyone has those. But that doesn't mean they're all equal, and it doesn't mean that they're like what makes them valid isn't this coherency that's downstream from some random assumption.
Right.
You know, there's something beyond that.
Yeah.
I think we'll get into that a little bit when we look at the tag that you kind of constructed there.
Yeah. And that's going to become very relevant. And I think, you know, when I first saw this argument too, I really thought that it was kind of a skeptical argument. Like I thought at first that they're making this argument that you can't know things for certain. And, you know, because it seems kind of baked into the idea that everyone reasons from their basic presuppositions, kind of assumes like, okay, so then there's no objective knowledge that we could both share. We're all just arguing from the subjective position. So at first it sounded to me like it was going to lean on that kind of skepticism and almost suggest, hey, well, the best we can do is the proper beliefs. We're never going to get to knowledge itself. And there are some arguments where they kind of sound like that. But when we get into tag, it became clear to me that that's actually not what they're saying. So we can, Van Til, the guy who came up with the whole Presup and tag framework, he had his own version of this, but I'm going to go over one that's a little bit closer to what Jay is saying. And I'm not trying to straw man him or anything. I really think this is one of the best descriptions of what he's trying to say. So in the tag argument, he's saying that if the preconditions for intelligibility, which would be things like the laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, objective truth, if those things exist, then God exists. And the preconditions for intelligibility do exist, which is to say knowledge exists, therefore God exists. So that's kind of the first half of his argument, essentially. And this is where I think the biggest strength of all of this is. I think this is actually a very Platonic type of argument, because what he's saying here is that in order for there to be anything that we can know, then there needs to be a source of that knowledge, essentially. And that source cannot itself be a being. It can't be sense perception. It's not even going to be reason, right? Like it's very like the divided line when I looked at this, right? Like we're starting and saying, okay, we can take sense perception to be belief. That's what Plato calls it in the divided line. And these tag guys are very good at causing doubt about our sense perceptions, because they can be right, they can be wrong, we can be mistaken very easily, so they can't really be trusted as the source of truth and knowledge. And then people will go, well, what about reason? I have reasons for things, right? And then they cause doubt about reason because they use things like Agrippa's Trilemma, which we'll talk about, which is, you know, basically a way to refute any justified true belief. And so what are you left with? You know, you're like, okay, I can't reason my way to it. Sense perception's been ruled out. You know, you're kind of moving up the divided line. And what you're left with is there is this knowledge, but there is, you find out you don't have a justification for it. And then Jay makes the turn. He goes, you see, our worldview justifies the existence of this knowledge. And that's why my worldview is better than your worldview, and you're wrong. Right? So
it's a brilliant move, really.
It is. And like, that's like, I think when you lay it out, I'm honestly impressed by it. I'm like, that's a pretty solid argument. Like, I get why people get stumped by it and kind of miss what the point is. But there are problems.
Yeah.
So, and we'll get into our part, because where it really goes wrong is the second half of it. So he establishes that idea, which ends in this, therefore God exists, but then immediately moves into only Eastern Orthodoxy, and my version of it, can ground this nature of God. It's the only worldview that's got all of the bits and pieces that make knowledge possible, essentially. So this is where it really does start to become this very epistemological argument, right? Because it's all based on this idea of the preconditions of intelligibility, and basically proving, like, what world do we have to live in order for intelligibility to exist? What does that have to look like? And from the TAG guy's perspective, it's always Christian theism. It's the Trinity, basically. And it, you know, I think it's telling, though, that it's not only Orthodox guys who use this argument, right? Jay is going to make the argument that only Eastern Orthodoxy is the way that this can work. But I forget what Van Til was, like Reformed Presbyterian or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, that's where he was arguing from. So he made the same move, but he was just saying, well, only my Reformed theology can be that thing. And I kind of jokingly did that in my own tag, saying, like, only Neoplatonism or Platonism could ground that. And I'm doing that more tongue in cheek, just to say that, like, anybody you can insert whatever you want at that point, and then just keep making this argument for coherence, right?
Yeah. And I've always thought the tag argument was best used on atheists.
Yes.
For, like, who was it that said it, that Darwin to Jesus guy said, it's great for showing the logical argument for theism. And I think that's where it's best suited, is when you're arguing against atheists and, you know, they're attacking your worldview of God. Where's your evidence? And you're using these everyday faculties that they're using and that they take for granted, and you're bringing those into question, and you're saying, well, you know, what's your basis for knowledge at all? Like, what is your basis for truth? And you can kind of force them into this dilemma of either taking the truth route, which is to say there has to be something transcendent that truth is grounded in, which we call God, or they have to say there's no truth, which they just lost right there, because then it's like, well, what's the point of arguing at all? Just shut up.
Yeah. I mean, that's the brilliance of the argument. And that's why it does make sense. Like, there's a lot of good usefulness to that. And I think there's some truth to that too. You know, as Platonists, we're not grounding truth in reason. We're not grounding truth in sense perception. We're actually saying it's something above all of those things and ultimately grounded in God. So, you know, this is a very useful position, I think, for us to adopt. But I think we don't have to do this second part where we go, like, only our worldview accounts for this. And that's where I think we kind of can open up the field a little bit. It's not really about that our worldview is more coherent necessarily. You know, I think we're going to show that knowledge is something that exists in a particular way that's actually available to everybody. And really, this gets to a point of, I think, about all good apologetics out there on the Christian side. And this is one of the reasons why I like reading a lot of Christian apologetics, is that almost all of their arguments do not prove the Trinity. When you look at Thomas Aquinas's 5 proofs for God, they do not prove the Trinity at all. They prove theism. like philosophical theism, which is essentially Platonism, right? They push you towards that view. And this is really no different. When you get into the preconditions for intelligibility, those preconditions exist, therefore God exists. There's no Trinity there, right? Like you can make that argument all on its own, and it's a Platonic argument, or it's at least compatible, right?
Yeah, it starts to become pretty squirrely once they actually tie in the Trinity, because you'll be following them and then they talk about the Trinity and you go, wait, hold on, how are you getting there? Like, where's, there's a huge leap of their logic to get to. Therefore, Jesus Christ is the source of all knowledge and truth and logic and reasoning. And you're like, what? The guy who was in Galilee, 2,000 years ago and was killed by the Pharisees, that's the grounding of all truth and reality.
Right, yeah. It's this carpenter, guys.
Yeah.
This carpenter 2,000 years ago. He's what makes this whole thing work. Nothing makes sense without him. Yeah, it doesn't really make sense when you think about it on its face. But then again, that's why they're going to shift and then start talking about worldviews. So we can get into some of those arguments too. Like the other day I was listening to one guy, he's another Presup guy, and he was talking about how the Trinity is required to solve the problem of the one and the many. And this is something I've heard Jay use this before and others, but I don't even see how that makes sense. Like part of their argument with the Trinity is basically to show that like a monism can't work. You can't have monism because if you have all is one type of monism, then you can't explain manyness. Manyness has to become like an illusion, or you have to make some kind of excuse for its existence. And then on the flip side, if you just have manyness, you can't really explain how reality even functions. Like how do all of these many things have any common existence or even relate to one another? And funny enough, I completely agree. I would look at that and go, yeah, substance monism or like a Parmenidean type of monism doesn't work. And that's why, you have to accept things like change is illusion and difference is illusion. These are all fake. And this is something that Plato realizes doesn't make sense. It ends up being his argument against the Parmenidean monists, is that that's not quite right. But he also makes the same claim against the Heracliteans that, well, it can't all just be particulars either, right? Because there is a unity to things, and things are unified in this common reality. So how does that work? And I was making actually on that guy's video, I made a comment and he ended up deleting it. Maybe it made too much sense. I don't know. But I think Platonic metaphysics actually solves this problem perfectly. And, we solve it in the idea of sameness and difference are secondary to the one, right? These are the first sort of fundamentals of intelligibility. And I think it's maybe we can kind of explore like, what is intelligibility? Because that's part of this argument. And I've heard some people be really confused by it, where they're like, what do you mean by it, objective intelligibility or whatever, what intelligibility is in general? And for us, this would be the capacity for anything to be known. And the one way I look at it is it's kind of like the laws of logic. I'm not saying that like it is the laws of logic necessarily. Those are propositions, but what those laws of logic represent, which are the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and the law of excluded middle. Those are the three logical laws, three basic logical laws. And that is essentially what intelligibility is. It's those three things together. In order for something to be intelligible, it has to be what it is. It can't be what it isn't. And it can't be some murky thing in the middle where you're being nondescript, right? Without that, nothing is intelligible. It doesn't make sense without those three things. And Plato kind of boils these down into what he calls limit and unlimited, essentially, or sameness and difference, right? And so that is the grounds of what makes intelligibility possible. And for the life of me, I cannot see how the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit solve that problem or provide that. Like, right? Like, what is it about that Trinity that makes those laws possible?
Yeah, that's where the non sequitur comes in.
Right.
So it makes sense up to that moment, and I think it would be better just kind of left at this transcendent God.
Yeah.
You know, what we're calling God is that transcendent, you can't even really say principle, but we call it the one, which
Sure.
grounds intelligibility. And what's kind of built in there to intelligibility too, you know, A is not A, is this idea of isness, which is, you know, just being. And so right there we have this intelligibility, which is this kind of recognition, or maybe let's say this unification with being, with what is, and God is necessarily that which grounds being. And so it's already this perfectly ordered, chain that goes from knowledge, or even all the way down to sense perception, up to higher reasoning, intelligibility, being, and then beyond being, transcendent God. So I don't know why trying to impose this idea of like three persons who are actually one. This is where we'd hold up the notepad with a number 3 on it. Say, is this one or is this 3? But it introduces a level of complication, and it's very like befuddling, and really the only way that you can argue that it's necessary is if you are taking a presuppositional stance and saying, well, I have to believe this because it's part of my worldview, because I accept the Bible and I accept Christian theology, you know, wholesale, so I can't contradict this. So we have to try to fit a way, make a way basically to impose this Trinity. And it's just so much cleaner, and I think it makes more sense if you just leave it out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, I don't envy them for having to make a defense for that worldview, because at some level, I think presuppositionalism is already a concession to the fact that they can't really win arguments on equal ground, right? Like the whole argument is based on this idea, like, okay, well, we can't argue on neutral ground. That's something we don't want to do. So we're going to argue on this kind of unequal ground of dragging you into arguing about presuppositions or worldviews, and then the coherence of said worldviews. So I think baked into that is this idea that there isn't necessarily an objective reality that we can both observe and have an argument over. And we can't even agree on things like the laws of logic, for example, right? We have to we're trying to justify those things themselves before we can even get into the argument. But I think one of the biggest questions there is, what is it about coherence that implies any kind of truth value anyways? Yeah. That's a buried assumption in this whole precept thing, where it's like, who cares? I've often said it's like the Marvel universe is coherent. Like, it doesn't mean it's true. Like, plenty of things are internally coherent.
Yeah, and there is this sleight of hand where there's an appeal to their specific religious theology and their tradition, and they're already telling you we can't reason with you. They're telling you that, right? We don't accept reason, yet we do accept coherency, and anytime you're incoherent, we're going to point that out. And also, that's a logical fallacy. And you're going, well, why do you guys accept logical fallacies? If reason is just this human thing that's distorted by sin, it's like, what use is that to you? So it's very interesting, because they're almost speaking out of both sides of their mouth by saying, well, your position's incoherent, ours is more coherent, but also human reason is a distortion and it's impure, and we have to appeal to revelation.
Right. So, but according to the laws of logic, I'm more coherent than you. Yes. And that coherency means something. Yes. Right? Like, all of that's baked into it. But I think a lot of people do just, they do believe in the laws of logic. Most people do, right? And most people do believe that coherency is better than incoherency. And so they're kind of riding on that. But that itself then becomes this thing that it's like, well, why aren't we questioning that too? if we're going to go
Right.
through this whole process, right? Excuse me.
Yeah, and I like that there is one thing that Jay does, and I do think it's a very valid form of proof, and I think you would agree with this, which is the impossibility of the contrary. You'll hear him say that all the time. Well, we know it because of the impossibility of the contrary. I think he does a very poor job of demonstrating the impossibility of the contrary to something like the Trinity, or when you get into the specifics of their theology with Jesus and everything. But when it comes to the existence of knowledge and the intelligibility of the world and the order of the world and the existence of a transcendent God that grounds all things, I think it's very valid, and I think you use it in your tag essentially, right? That is a valid form of proof, which is the impossibility of the contrary.
Yeah, and we can talk a little bit about that. So where I think that impossibility of the contrary is most useful is in the argument for knowledge that we're going to make. So if we look at why, in his argument, he's saying as kind of the second part that the preconditions for intelligibility do exist, right? So we are accepting as just kind of an a priori truth that knowledge exists. And this is where I realized I had TAG and these guys wrong. I thought they were making an argument where like knowledge didn't necessarily exist, but that isn't what they're saying. They are saying knowledge exists. And they are saying that from this impossibility of the contrary type of position, right? And the way that really works is if you say knowledge doesn't exist, I go, do you know that? And you can say, well, I guess I don't know that. Okay. All right. So it's a self-refuting argument. So you can't really make the argument that knowledge doesn't exist. It's an incoherent argument. And this is just the problem with all skepticism. Like if he gets in a debate with anybody who's a skeptic who thinks that, knowledge is subjective, for example, it's like, do you know that knowledge is subjective? You're making an objective statement about knowledge being subjective. And so the only thing you can say then is like, well, no, that's just my opinion. Okay. Well, I don't care about your opinion. There you go. Like that's it.
Yeah. And when they enter into the debate, they're giving up this, valid opinion, and because they're trying to seek something beyond that, right? When you're entering into debate, you are assuming that we are on the neutral grounds of trying to find what makes the most sense, which is that which is most reasonable. So you're already appealing to the existence of knowledge, intelligibility, and reason.
Yeah. I mean, even think about the argument itself. It's like, okay, if you win the argument and knowledge doesn't exist, what have you won? You haven't won anything. You've just like argued over nothing, right? And he points that out to some people, and I think it's a really good thing to point out that it really doesn't make sense if you're going to make those kind of arguments if you think knowledge doesn't exist, because you're operating under this assumption that like it means something that I made an argument and my argument was coherent and you received it and you couldn't refute my argument. But if the idea is all of that is just subjective nonsense, well then you're doing nothing. It literally is meaningless. It's meaningless babble, essentially. So I think that's a powerful argument that we can use against skeptics, and we should use it. So we can kind of start from, sorry, I'm dying over here, coughing every 10 seconds. I've been doing a keto diet, and I'm having that like butter coffee in the morning.
Oh yeah, I know that feeling very well.
Yeah, I think my throat's like an oil slick or something. So I don't know. So
do you put the MTC oil in it?
Yeah, I do the MCT and everything. Which that stuff is so weird. It's such a strange, like slippery oil. It like gets everywhere. It somehow like crawls out of the bottles that it's in. It's like I don't understand how it works.
Every single nozzle on those bottles is just covered in it. And you're like, I don't remember spilling that or letting it seep out. It's just there.
No, it just like
goes through the plastic.
Yeah, maybe it does. I wouldn't be surprised. Okay. Maybe all his coughing is in honor of Jay Dyer. I feel like he's always coughing in all of his streams.
Just in his glasses, coughing.
Just do that the whole time. What I'm talking about is, so anyways, so yeah, getting back to the argument here, they are really effective at making that argument that knowledge exists. And I think that that's a starting point for us as Platonists. We should go on the offensive and use this section of the argument more or less as it is. The one thing that I would go a little bit further on, though, is we were talking about the sameness and difference when it comes to intelligibility. That kind of what defines intelligibility is this sameness and difference, which is the laws of logic, essentially, that things are what they are and they're not what they're not. That is what allows us to be able to have knowledge, to think, to be intelligible. And as Parmenides says, it's also what defines being, right? And this is why our thinking has a correspondence with reality. It's because, as Parmenides says, thinking is the same as being. So in order to think, we have to have these sort of logical laws that allow us to define one thing over another. But just the same, those things that we have, that we think about, have to correspond with reality. If they don't correspond with reality, who cares, right? Who cares that I can identify something and know that it's this thing and not another thing? If that then doesn't correspond to actual reality, then it's just stuff I'm thinking about in my head. But there is a correspondence there. But what that means, though, is that if we're looking for the source of that, if we're looking for the source of this quality of intelligibility, of sameness and difference, and that is analogous to being, then that means that whatever is the cause of it cannot itself be another being or being itself, because that's what we're trying to explain. We're trying to explain what is the ground of being, what causes being to exist, what allows it to exist. Well, obviously that can't be another being, because then you'd have to explain, well, where did that one come from, right? And it can't just be being itself, because again, we're trying to explain that. So that doesn't make sense either. You end up just being circular, that being is the cause of being, right? So by necessity, it has to be something beyond being. But if it is something beyond being, then it doesn't have any qualities to it, because it doesn't have, it precedes, you could say, the laws of logic. It's before that distinction that we're making about like the law of identity and the law of non-contradiction. It's before that. And anything before that doesn't have those things. And so we, as a misnomer, call it the one. But that's a mistake. It's not the one. And that's why Plato says that the one neither is nor is one, right? And later Platonists just start calling it the ineffable, because they go, it's not really the one. They must have gotten a bunch of arguments about that. And I'm like, all right, it's a bad name. We admit it.
Yeah, ineffability is really the best we can come up with, and that's just say we can't even wrap our minds around it, because it's beyond mind.
Well, and what are we saying here? It's genuinely transcendent. Mm-hmm. That's what we mean by saying that there's this transcendent God above all that grounds all things, that is the productive power of all things. Mm-hmm. We're not saying we have necessarily knowledge of it, because you can't really have knowledge of it. It's what causes knowledge, and causes it in a dependent sense. Like the ability to have knowledge is dependent on those laws, and those laws are dependent on something that must be beyond them, that grounds them, that's beyond our capacity to understand logically through knowledge or anything, right? So that argument there is so much more airtight than the argument that these guys are making for the Trinity. And I think they're just stopping short, right? Like if you just followed this line of logic to say that the preconditions for intelligibility exist, then God exists. Those preconditions do exist, therefore God exists. It's like you can kind of expand that out into saying like, okay, well, what do we know about those preconditions? What are they? And what would that tell us about whatever grounds them, right? Mm-hmm. And they don't ask that question. And I think maybe it's deception, maybe it's they don't want to get into it or whatever. But I think if you're just looking at it from a logical standpoint, we again get back to some kind of theism, but not Trinitarianism.
So how do we go from that to extrapolating a theology? Because, Jay Dyer and the Orthodox guys, they kind of mash the two together, right? They use that to justify their theology. But I think this goes back to earlier conversations we've had, which is the separation of theology and metaphysics. So what's the interplay there between those two? Like, where's their error, and what are we doing to avoid that error?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think their error is the same error that most Christians are making when they're doing theology, which is they're starting from their conclusion and then working backwards. So, for a guy like Jay even, or any of these Presup guys, it's like they're presupposing, they're starting from the worldview of like, well, Christianity is the truth and correct 100%. And so I'm going to argue everything toward that goal of proving that. And that's not actually the way that Platonists construct their arguments or the way that we like to do philosophy. Our philosophy is Socratic in the sense that what we know is that we don't know. So we're not saying that we have the answer. We're actually saying, well, let's assume we don't know anything, or, let's assume we don't have the answers. And let's follow from first principles, kind of work our way up using dialectic, right? We're going to use that dialectical process to figure out what's going on and get a clearer and clearer picture, right? So we don't make an assumption at the beginning about what the conclusion is going to be. We don't know what the conclusion is going to be till we get there. And the big problem for the Christians then is they're taking their worldview that's based on revelation. So they're taking this whole Christian revelation about the Trinity, which, I mean, you can argue whether the Trinity is even really in the Bible or not. Some people would say it is. Some people say it isn't. But they're starting that as using that as a starting point, and then sort of projecting it onto these metaphysical categories. And the fact of the matter is, like, there isn't really a way to do that without trying to make some other kind of argument that's not necessarily directly logical, right? You have to make that turn where you go, oh, well, it's more coherent this way, right? Like, this solves these particular problems of coherency, and I'm going to show how yours doesn't make sense, so mine does make sense. And then you have some basis for it. But it's not apparent. Like, I don't think it's ever going to be apparent from first principles why the Trinity solves any kind of problems like these. And that's kind of why I think they take that turn, right? They get to that point, and then they get the God exists part at least.
Yeah.
And then they're like, and that's why, my worldview is more correct than the other ones. They take a total turn. Like, the argument almost is two completely separate arguments. There's the first part, and then the second part is kind of a separate argument that they graft onto it, essentially. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no. I think what you're saying there is this kind of, it's touching upon two different things, which is the universal aspect, which is this argument, this metaphysical argument for the existence of God and the existence of knowledge, because those are universals. But when you're getting into the theology, like you said, that's a separate argument because it's in a separate category. You're no longer talking about universals. And this is why, their religion is this kind of universalist approach where it's, no, Jesus is not just our God. He's not just a Christian God. He is God. And He is this metaphysical principle we're talking about. He is this transcendent that we're referring to. And we stop there and we say, well, these are the universals, knowledge and that which transcends knowledge. Everyone needs that to have any kind of an argument at all or a worldview at all. Everything else, though, when it comes to particular theologies, what the God's names are that you're calling them, how you're worshiping them, those are the particulars. And those are two separate things. So I think Platonists, a lot of the time, are... I think they're wrongly accused of practicing the same kind of universalism as Christians, and it's because they use a lot of our kind of arguments. Like TAG is pretty Platonic in nature because you're following these principles of reasoning and you're leading to a conclusion of transcendence and in a sense, like grounding these universal principles. So they're using that, and that is a very Platonic thing to do, but that's not to say that the theology is universal. And that's where the difference is. We are not saying, oh, our God, like the one is not a God, right? The transcendent is not just a particular God that we're trying to impose on everyone. It's, no, this is just God. This is the transcendent nature of the divine that all the gods are participating in. So I'd say that's the difference there. And it's really hard to emphasize that to, these types who want to just lump us all into the same category. Because there is a fine distinction there, but it's a very important one.
Yeah, and I think a great example of that is the idea that Christ is the Logos, right? Like the Logos is a universal principle, right? We're talking about essentially the principle of intelligibility, the principle of like divine mind and reason that permeates the universe and orders the universe. And, their claim from Revelation is that is Jesus Christ, the carpenter from 2,000 years ago. He is that guy, and only him is that guy. And, this goes to the points I've made about metaphysics and theology, that any time that we ascribe a particular theological person to a metaphysical principle, we are inherently going to become a sort of universalist, have a universalist perspective. And we're also going to engage in something like the Mosaic distinction that I've talked about before, of like the true religion and the false religion, right? Because if Jesus Christ is the Logos, then that means that the demiurge isn't the Logos, not the one from Plato, that Ishvara in Hinduism, he's not the Logos. Zeus is not the Logos. It's only him. So that means that only Christianity is correct. It's just by default. Like if that assumption is true, then that's it. It's over, right? There's only one true religion. But that's exactly the thing that they can't prove outside of a revelatory framework. Like there's no arguing from first principles that a Jewish apocalyptic preacher from the first century is the reasoning principle of the universe. Like there's just, you're not doing that outside of a revelatory framework. So it doesn't work.
And I think they can sort of get away with that again through this kind of sleight of hand by, what it is they mean when they say knowledge, which for them, it is belief. It's a type of belief. It's justified true belief. And that is a huge distinction, because we do not subscribe to that, which is called, standard analysis is what it's often referred to. We do not subscribe to that at all. So what's the difference there with the Platonic version of knowledge compared to this Christian idea?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. So you're right about standard analysis. So standard analysis is sort of framework within epistemology to understand what knowledge is, and what it leads to is this idea that justified true belief is knowledge. So what is justified true belief? That really goes back to Plato's Theaetetus. It's where we get sort of the original argument for this. And sometimes he's even credited with the theory that knowledge equals justified true belief, even though that's absolutely not what Plato was saying at all.
He blows it out of the water, actually.
He blows it out of the water, but people say that that's what, where this argument comes from. And so the way it basically goes is, I'm going to summarize from my memory of the Theaetetus here. But they're discussing like what knowledge is, and they start out with belief, basically, like seeing things. And when we say belief, we think of like, oh, I believe this idea, that idea. But the way that they would use it in that dialogue, their idea of belief is a lot more like sense perception. And so Socrates uses this example of like, what if I see somebody and I'm like, I'm 100% sure in my mind that like that is Bob. But then as he starts walking closer to me, I see, oh no, that's not Bob, as somebody else. So my sense perception was off, right? I thought I saw something, but I actually saw something else. But I was 100% certain that I saw it. But as I got more sense perception, more sense data, it became clear that I wasn't correct. And so he uses that to say, well, we can't really trust our sense perceptions that they are knowledge, because they're very fallible. Like they could be right sometimes, they can be wrong sometimes. We can be deceived, we can see illusions, and we're all very aware of this. When you see a magic trick, it looks like you're seeing magic, and you're not. You're seeing an optical illusion, or you're seeing something that's presents something to you that looks a particular way. So we rule that out. So that's just what they would call belief. So then they define it a little further and go, well, what about if it's a true belief, right? Like you say, okay, well, you could be mistaken, but when you're not mistaken, you've got the true belief then, right? That's the one that is actually true. What about that? And so they dive into, is that actually a good example of it? Let me see if I can find the good. I forget what the argument he makes in there. Do you remember it off the top of your head against the true belief?
No, it'd probably be best to pull it up there.
Yeah. I just want to make sure I get it right about his whole argument. I'm blanking on it. Oh, right. So then, Socrates uses this example about a courtroom where he's talking about an orator that uses persuasive arguments to reach a true verdict. So, like, I'm trying to think of a good way to describe this. So, like, he's saying, like, the jurors are going to have a true belief about something. Like, this orator came out and he convinced you of this argument that this is really the facts of an event that happened. And the jurors believe it, and their belief is true, right? Like, the orator didn't deceive them. It's not a deceptive argument. He just very persuasively and correctly argued to the point where the people on the jury who were not there, who do not know this directly, but they've come to find the argument and they go, okay, yeah, I agree with it. And they're correct. But they don't actually know, right? They're getting this sort of secondhand, and it just happens to be true is basically what it is. Like, it happens to be true, but let's just suppose that the orator was being deceptive. They're operating off of similar criteria here, but say the orator deceived them. They might think they have the true belief, but they don't. And so the whole point of it is about certainty. Can you actually be certain that your, quote, true belief is really true, is really knowledge, essentially? And you can't. You could be wrong, you could be right. So it's not a marker for certainty.
Right. So there's always that, no matter what, if it is belief, there's always that fallibility there. It's
right.
never
you still have
infallible.
a fallibility. Mm-hmm. Right. And so they move to the third part of this, which is essentially justified true belief, but they call it true belief with an account or a logos.
With logos, yeah.
Yeah. And so you can see the problem of the true belief thing. It's like, okay, you could be convinced of this true belief and maybe you're right, but even if you're right, you don't actually know that you're right, right? You may happen to be right. This is kind of the Gettier problem, is basically the same idea, more or less. So they say, well, what if you had an account, right? If you had like this rational argument to be made, and maybe that's evidence or, some reasonable account of why you should believe it. But you get into the same problem there too. And what Socrates points out is like, well, even if you have an account of what the true belief is, you still have to call into question that account. Like, how do you know that you know that account, right? Mm-hmm. He's going through a lot of the same process that you see in some of these debates where they just keep pressing, well, how do you know that? That's kind of what Socrates is doing here. It's just at every level where we're adding something to the argument and adding something to the argument and adding something to the argument, you keep going, well, how is it that you know that? Mm-hmm. So even if you have a reasoned account, you still have to ask yourself that question too, of how you would actually know that. So I think actually a sort of further explanation of this argument comes from Agrippa's Trilemma. I think that's where we get kind of a fully fleshed out. In the Theaetetus, it ends in aporia, which means it's a qualified unknowing. We don't actually get an answer to this particular problem. Basically, Socrates goes through each one of these and shows why there's reason to doubt that belief is knowledge, There's reason to doubt that true belief is knowledge, and there's reason to doubt that true belief within a logos or an account is knowledge. Then he just leaves it there. And it's not really till the divided line that we start to get kind of a clearer idea of what he means by what knowledge is. And what it really points to is that knowledge and belief are not the same thing. That's the ultimate end goal when we get to the divided line. He shows us that there's noesis, true knowledge, episteme on one end of this divided line, and then belief and illusion are on the other. And reason is kind of in the middle. But even reason is not necessarily true knowledge, the way that he's talking about it.
Right. It's almost like an intermediary between the two, right?
Yeah.
Almost like a bridge. Yeah, and what's really interesting about that is I think he emphasizes that knowledge and belief are concerned with different objects. And they call it the what is it? The distinct
objects theory.
Yeah, distinct objects theory.
Yeah.
Which is that you can never have belief, like you can't say, what is it? I know P, but I don't believe it. It's
right.
like these are two separate things entirely. And one is inerrant, or we should say, one is infallible because it is. It's just what is the state of things, which is knowledge, and the other is errant and fallible because it's propositional. And that's what Agrippa's trilemma demonstrates to us. Like, no matter what your belief is, I can always bring you back into the three horns and show how there's a hole there. It's incomplete in some way. Whereas what knowledge is entirely complete, right? It's full, it's whole. It's that which is completely. And you can't convey that. And when we try to convey it, we're forcing it into a proposition. We're essentially trying to convert it into what it is not. And then that is the thing that is being critiqued and scrutinized. And that's why it looks like, who's really to say
You can't prove it. You can't justify your position. Your worldview is incoherent.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. So there's so much that you said there that's great. And we should probably break it down a little bit.
Yes.
So
for sure.
For Agrippa's trilemma, like I said, I think this is a good, it dovetails really nicely with the Theaetetus argument that he's making, and I think actually makes a very, very similar argument, but a little more clearly. And so what Agrippa's trilemma is a critique of justified true belief. So it's a critique of that as the standard for knowledge, essentially. And we'll get into kind of what the conclusion of this argument is, because it has some Platonic implications at the end. But basically the way this works is the argument says that any justified true belief that you have, so even if you have an account, right, and you have the true belief, it is true, it's belief, and you have an account for it, let's take a look at that account part and go deeper into this. So it's kind of like the next step where Socrates leaves off a little bit and doesn't get too far into the weeds. But they show that any one of those accounts is going to end in one of three things. They call these horns. So it's a trilemma because there's three of these horns. So the first one is circular reasoning. So that obviously a logical fallacy. You're saying it's true because it's true, right? It is because it is. And so that's obviously not going to work. And the second one is infinite regress. So you could say, well, my justification for this is this. And you go, well, what's the justification for that? This other thing. And then, okay, what about this? It's another thing over here. And you can just keep going on and on forever, but you never reach a kind of ground of that account. And then the last one is sort of axiomatic statements or foundationalism, or an arbitrary stopping point, sometimes what they call it. So you just basically pick a thing and go like, no, you can't go further than that. People do this a lot with the laws of logic, where they'll just say like, no, the laws of logic just are. Like those are just axiomatically true. And really that is an arbitrary stopping point, because you're not explaining what grounds those laws. Why are those laws correct? You're just stopping there and not going all the way. That's what the transcendental argument ultimately does. It does have those as axiomatic, the laws of logic, because they do believe knowledge exists. So they're not skeptics, but they're saying they have an argument for what the ground of that intelligibility is, right? That's kind of how they escape Agrippa's trilemma.
Right.
But you can probably see from like most people are not going to get out of this problem. I mean, I've watched so many people debate with these tag guys and just get utterly destroyed by Agrippa's trilemma and not have any idea how to properly get out of it, because it's going to lead you down, I think, one of two to a dilemma, one of two other horns that you're going to have to go down. So if you get to the point where all of your attempts to justify a belief either end up getting called circular, infinite regress, or arbitrary, ad hoc, as Jay likes to say, then you're going to be in this situation where either you have to admit that knowledge doesn't exist, right? You're like, well, we can't justify anything, right? We can't justify your knowledge. That's not how it works. And I've seen people try to take that path, right? They just go like, what are you talking about? Like, that just is what it is. Like,
It's a brute
that's
fact,
how knowledge works.
right?
Yeah, it's a bare fact or whatever. It's a brute fact. And he's right to point out that that doesn't really make any sense. And some people may just kind of concede that no, like there isn't any such thing as knowledge the way you're describing, like absolute certainty. But at that point, you just kind of lose the argument, because you go back to that knowledge exists thing and you're saying, well, if knowledge just exists, how do you know that? You don't even know that. And so like your whole worldview just unravels in that moment, you know, and that's where they spike the football and, you know, Eastern Orthodoxy wins.
Yeah.
That's their whole thing.
Right.
So the other alternative, though, and this is the one that I think we as Platonists should be taking, is that what Agrippa's trilemma shows us is that knowledge is not belief. That's what it really is showing us, is that when you try to ground knowledge in propositional beliefs, and the proposition that we're talking about here is that account, right? So that proposition itself is always going to end in either circular reasoning, infinite regress, and axiomatic statements. The best you can achieve is a JTB. You can get justified true belief, right? Which is to say, you can get yourself all the way to the point where you're like, I have all of these propositions I believe in, and I have good reason to believe them. You can get that far, but having good reasons to believe something, and even if that belief happens to be true, that doesn't make it knowledge. Knowledge is something else. And that's what Plato is ultimately arguing when he's making the divided line argument, is saying that like all of these attempts to ground knowledge are going to fail because knowledge is not a belief at all. It's not, we're talking about something that's categorically different. So it kind of begs the question, I guess, like, well, then what is knowledge? If it's not a belief, if it's not a proposition, then what is it? And what Plato really says about it is that it's analogous to seeing. So I like to use the example of a triangle. Like when I have knowledge of what a triangle is, it's not that I know the proposition that it's a, you know, shape with 3 points, or, you know, I think it's angles equal 180 degrees or whatever. It's like, that's not what I'm saying, right? It's not that proposition. It's the direct identification in our minds with what a triangle is. Which is essentially our minds being at one with that concept. Like we have it, we see it. It's a form of seeing rather than it's a form of propositional knowing.
Yeah, so you gave the example to me one time of like a blue sky. Like how can you prove to someone that the sky is blue? Like when you look at the sky, you see, oh, the sky is blue. If you try to convert that into a proposition and explain it to someone, it's going to fail the three horns of, you know, Agrippa's trilemma every single time. Does that mean, well, I can't really say the sky is blue, I guess? It's like, no, it's just you are having a completely different, it's in a different category, because when you're seeing the blueness of the sky, it's a direct intuitive experience. You don't have to question it. You see it and you know, like, there is a unification there. And if you are trying to convey that, you are automatically, kind of disjointing that unification. You're splitting it up, and now it's becoming two separate things, which then it can be scrutinized and critiqued. So this kind of brings me to the question of, well, how do you attain knowledge then? Like, how do you actually attain it? And upon attaining it, are you able then to give that to other people, or is it just impossible to actually convey true knowledge?
Essentially, it's impossible. You can't necessarily give it to somebody in this way that you can give a proposition, right? Like I can give you justified true beliefs. If I say the sky is blue because I saw it, it's like, that's a justified true belief, sure. And like, you're right to point out that you could run that through the horns, and I'd invariably end up in one of them where I can't truly know that. So there's a difference between that direct seeing and any propositions about them. So I could never take that knowledge, like, I'm trying to think of a good way to explain it. Like, if I have the realization of the law of identity, that something is what it is, that A equals A, and even we can even add the law of non-contradiction, that A does not equal not A. The seeing of the reality of that is the knowledge. It's not the proposition. It's not the equation, right? It's the seeing that's the knowledge. And once you see it, once you see, say, what a triangle is, or once you see the law of identity, that, oh, something is what it is. It sounds very basic. Or when you see what a triangle is, it's that epiphany that you have in your mind where you identify that, and it clicks, where you go like, yes. And from that point forward, it's like you always know what a triangle is. You're never confused after that. You don't see a square and go like, should I get a ruler out and check if this is a triangle? No.
Right.
Like, you know that that's a triangle because you have this like identification that's immediately accessible to you. And that's a very like simple example. But it can't be expressed propositionally. What the proposition is doing is something completely different. What the proposition is doing is dianoetic. It's reasoning. But what it does is points you toward the reality. And that's all it can do, right? So I can explain to you what a triangle is in a propositional way. I could even draw one for you and all of this other stuff. And the best that can do is point you toward the direct realization of what it is, right? Yes. Which is an identity thing that's happening. It's an identification, a unity between what's in your mind and this object of knowledge, which we would call a form, right? It's that unity of those two things. And in that moment, they're the same thing.
I think Gerson described propositions as linguistic articulations of what the mind has already grasped via noesis. So they're secondary, they're fallible, and they're revisable.
Yes.
So it's like it's trying to point to that content that you already grasped, like you were just saying there. And, that's a tough thing to do. And that's why, there's always this problem too. I think when people hear this, they say, oh, so it's just like, personal experience. Like it's personally revealed to you. But that's not what we're saying, because when you bring up dianoia, there is a clear continuum all the way through this divided line. So it should also be the best logical explanation. It should make the most logical sense, but that is not the knowledge. We're just saying, no, it's beyond that. The knowledge is actually beyond that. We can have really valid arguments and strong evidence for it and strong logical proofs and whatever else, but we're just saying that's not the knowledge. The knowledge is this thing that it is pointing to, which can only be grasped intuitively, directly with the mind. It's a unification with the intelligible form, like what you're saying, the intelligible object.
Right.
So it's kind of a difficult thing to
Oh, it
argue
is.
for.
That's why we're doing this, because
Yeah.
I don't necessarily know that I have the perfect way to describe it yet. Like,
Right.
I wrote this big article talking about tag and all of these different ideas, and I'm still working through some of it, like how to kind of turn this into like a rock solid Platonic argument, but I'm starting to see the validity of certain parts of it and how it kind of operates, put all these pieces together. I think one of the things that makes it maybe the hardest is just the English language, in that we have a lot of presuppositions about what knowledge means, what that word means. And even in this, somebody could probably go look back and see that I'm actually using knowledge sometimes in two different ways, because we might use it to say like, do you know that the sky is blue? Well, the sky is a sense perception that you see through your eyes. And so that isn't actually knowledge, right? But we kind of colloquially will say things like that all the time. They're like, oh, like, I know my dog is a husky.
Yeah. I know I turned the stove off when I left home for work.
And what we're saying is like, actually those
certain.
things aren't true knowledge. That's not what we mean by it. And in Greek, it just does a better job at this. They have enough words to describe all of these different things. And so when we're talking about true knowledge, this kind of grasping of the forms directly, we're talking about episteme, which is what epistemology comes from, right? But that's what Plato says is the true knowledge. And the rest of these things are actually closer to beliefs. They really are beliefs, right? And none of them really obtain to episteme. So
I think that's what really opened my eyes to the whole epistemology question and the system that Plato uses, which is they have the best words for it.
Yeah.
And that is what you're talking about. Like, that is where our struggle is we blend these words and collapse them into one another. Whereas like in Plato's epistemology, episteme and doxa, which we call belief, but I also think that's kind of a rough translation and isn't really that neat either. Those are two entirely separate things. And I think the biggest thing is that for Platonism, knowledge is never derivative. Like, it's not derived from opinions and perceptions and observations. And that's what, JTB, justified true belief, is. It is derivative. So knowledge is not derivative from belief or opinion, but belief or opinion is actually derivative from knowledge, but it is not knowledge. So it's tricky. It's complex, and it's like it is the toughest question and the toughest debate that there is how do you know? And I think that's why, a lot of these Orthodox guys, they've made so much headway in that area. And I don't think it's because that they have the absolute best arguments. I think they're using good arguments like tag, but then when they're going into therefore orthodoxy, it's just a masterful work of rhetoric, I think.
Yeah.
They're masterfully navigating these words and the kind of, they know that the English language is not the most precise, and they're drawing from ancient arguments that are in Greek and Latin, and so they can kind of almost take advantage of that, whether they're doing that consciously or not, deliberately or not. But I think that is what's going on, is they're almost taking advantage of the lack of the English precision when it comes to these kind of concerns.
And man, we have that problem with so many things. Like being is another one of those ones that is just butchered by the English language. The Greeks had so many different words to describe that. So on, toon, just being as we usually think of it, but also ousia, which is really more like essence, but sometimes gets translated as being, and it's like, we have a ton of problems like that with English. It's just kind of a clumsy philosophical language sometimes. And also, depending on what you're reading, it's like they may translate the word differently because I was reading one the other day that, oh my God, it was the Haran book, the David Haran dialogues that I just got.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And what did he translated one word as reason. And I was like, oh, that is not a good That is not a good translation.
Is it nous?
I think it was. Yeah, it was nous. And he translated, he said that, I know. And he said it everywhere. Throughout the whole book, he translated as reason. And I'm like, oh man, like, that's not really what that means.
Yeah.
So, but that's a good example where like you might read all of David Horan's Plato where he's using, translating nous as reason, which typically we would say dianoia is reason, you know? So you could get super confused after reading all of that.
Nous is best left as nous.
Yeah, and you know what's weird? He didn't translate it in the Timaeus. That was one of the reasons I bought the book, because in Timaeus he just leaves nous alone and just calls it nous, and I'm like, oh, chef's kiss. Yeah. I wish they did that everywhere.
Right.
But yeah. Anyways,
Interesting.
So I want to draw attention to one thing with that, where the sort of absurdity of the question. Because when these tag guys are asking you, how do you know that? Because that's what they're going to do, right? If I make this whole argument to them and say, well, this is what knowledge really is, that justified true belief doesn't obtain knowledge, and knowledge is this other object, essentially. It's this other cognitive object that's not the same thing as belief at all. Well, what are they going to do? How do you know that?
Yeah.
Right? That's immediately what they're going to ask me. And the argument goes something like this. Like, you're looking at Agrippa's trilemma and saying, well, every single attempt that we make to get a belief, a justified true belief even, to obtain to knowledge, it fails. Every single time. You cannot do it. Okay? And we've already established the absurdity of saying that knowledge doesn't exist. So knowledge exists, but you cannot obtain it via any form of JTB. Every single one of them fails. So what's the conclusion? The simple conclusion is knowledge and belief are not the same thing. So that's the argument that I would present to them. And then if they want to question that then and go like, yeah, well, how do you know that? They still want to press that question. The absurdity of it becomes clear, because what they're asking me for is a JTB for knowledge. Mm-hmm. They're saying, well, how do you know that? Give me a justified true belief. What's your justification for that? It's like, you're asking for a JTB, and I just explained to you how that's not what it is. And it can't be what it is. So you're kind of calling out the deception there, where it's like the whole reason they're using Agrippa's trilemma in the first place is to cause this doubt about beliefs that people have. But if you turn that in on knowledge itself, it eats itself. It becomes like a self-refuting argument, because it's like you're trying to get me to give you the tool to beat me to death with, you know? And what you do when you explain that these are two distinct objects, they're not the same thing, and you lay it out like it did with Agrippa's trilemma, that whole argument just falls apart. You can't use it anymore. Mm-hmm. It just falls flat.
Yeah. And so they're saying basically, give me your justification for that, and you just have to hit him with the Chad no.
Basically. Yeah. I mean, that's essentially how it goes.
And I think one thing you told me, which was, when we're kind of seeing these tactics that a lot of these Orthodox guys are using when they use tag, when they call out a fallacy, you almost have to turn it around on them and apply that same thing to them. It's like, what does it matter if it's a fallacy? What does it matter? How do you know that's a fallacy? Why should I care if it's a fallacy? Because and correct me if I'm wrong, but you almost have to get them to realize, in order for us to have this discussion, we both have to assume that knowledge exists, that there is such a thing as knowledge. And there's a distinction between what is knowledge and what isn't, because we wouldn't be having a conversation if everything is knowledge. But, so we're recognizing knowledge exists. There are things that are not knowledge, and then there is knowledge, and we're trying to tease out, which is which here. So it kind of draws out these parameters of belief, justified belief, as they call it, and then knowledge, which is actually kind of like the grounding of the parameters rather than being inside of the parameters. Right.
Like, it's knowledge that makes these arguments valid or invalid. Mm-hmm. It's what makes a belief a better belief or a worse belief. That's what knowledge does. But it's not itself a belief. It's not itself an argument. It's not itself propositional. It's what causes those things to have any value in the first place, right? So it's like, you can almost compare it to light. And I think that's what Plato does. He does kind of relate it to this kind of, sun type of analogy when we're getting into like the cave. And it's the thing that illuminates all things. It illuminates reason. It illuminates even your belief, right? And it's what causes that line is the fact that as you get closer to the actual real thing itself, like you're getting closer. You start with just these beliefs, then you get true beliefs, then you get a reasoned belief, and all of those things just kind of keep pointing you toward it, but none of those things are the sun. That's you coming out of the cave,
yes.
right? It's like, okay, I realize the illusions are not the thing, that it's not the shadows. And then you see the fire and you go, okay, that's interesting, but that's still not the cause of things that I'm looking for. And then you get all the way up and you look around and you see, oh, I can see the world. I can see it for what it is. I can see trees and grass and plains and mountains. That's still not the sun. The sun is that which illuminates all of those things, right? And so that's kind of the line that we're driving toward, is to try to point to that. But I think you're totally right to acknowledge that they're accepting that knowledge exists. And I think we ride kind of on that. And that, in a way, becomes a great way for us to turn this argument around, because we're going to say that's the common ground, right? They want to say, no, there's no presupposition. We're all just arguing from presuppositions. And so we're going to argue about worldviews. But if we're going to say knowledge exists, all right, now we're in a different territory.
Right.
Because we can actually say, well, actually, that is the neutral ground. The neutral ground is that intelligibility exists. We both agree with that.
Yeah.
So if it does, then we can argue from these points and we can use logic and reason because we're accepting of the fact that that does exist.
Yeah. And the irony of it is you need intelligibility to exist to even make their first premise of everything is argued from presuppositions. It's like,
even
well,
the
we're
argument
supposed to
from
just
coherence,
accept that? Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, yes.
Like if they're going to go and shift and say, okay, we're going to make this argument for coherence. It's like, well, how are you able to even make an argument for coherence? And why does your argument from coherence have any meaning whatsoever? Unless we've already accepted that knowledge does exist, that intelligibility does exist. And we could argue, I guess, then about what explains that better, right?
Yes.
That becomes sort of the contingency. So we already have like a good basis to go on. And then this kind of circles back to the argument that I had at the beginning of this. Like they're going to make this turn that this whole revelatory framework and the Trinity and all of this other stuff, that's the coherent, that's the clearest framework. But I think we've got a very clear argument to say, okay, we've already agreed on knowledge and we've agreed what is the sort of requirements of knowledge. It's even a part of their argument, more or less, like the laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, objective truth. What best explains that?
Yes.
Right? And I think we can make a very clear argument from there of what's required for those things is this transcendent God. And that's 100% true. But it's not the Trinity. That's not apparent.
Right. Non sequitur.
Yeah, that's the non sequitur. That's where they're lost. And I think if we can weave ourselves into that part of the argument, I think we've got a really solid chance to kind of turn a lot of these tag arguments fully Platonic. And I don't think that this should even be a surprise because, like I said, all of these proofs for God always end up proving the Platonic God. They never end up proving the Trinity and the revelations of Christianity. That's always something else they have to argue for, and it's the weakest part of their argument. Yeah. It's the hard. Like I said, I don't envy them because that's actually very, very difficult to make that case. So I think like wrestling them to that point is really how we should start to use this tag argument, essentially. Like, and it really shouldn't be that hard. I mean, we've gone an hour and a half explaining it, but I think if we just grant the first three parts of the tag argument and just say, yes, the whole thing about preconditions for intelligibility that leads to saying God exists. Those preconditions do exist. Knowledge exists. Therefore, God exists. Sold. No problem. We agree. Right? And then immediately move into that next part and go, yeah, let's talk about what we can say explains that.
Yeah.
And I think they're going to lose on that ground, having to defend things like the Trinity. Although they are good at it. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
Like, they're good at making the case.
Yeah, and I think Neil from Gnostic Informant, I think he kind of came into the debate with Jay taking that approach.
Yeah.
And I do think it was a bit of a goof for him. Like, it was kind of like a fun tactic
Yeah.
that he was just employing. Like, I'm just going to use the same thing against him.
Right.
But it did make for a very different debate compared to, what Jay is used to, because
Right.
Neil was essentially just going, yeah, no, okay. Like, all right, yeah, I agree with everything. But instead of Jesus, it's Apollo.
Right.
And then it became a weird debate where it's like, there's no neutral ground there for them to
Yeah.
prove or disprove each other. So I think Jay recognized the tactic, and he instead focused on a few little kind of moot points almost,
Right.
with the whole 3-1 notepad thing they spent so
Right.
long on, which is just a funny thing that they're kind of talking past one another. But yeah. I think it is a good tactic, and it's also not just is it a good strategy, but it's just a valid question, and it is something that's necessary for critiquing their argument and trying to come to a better understanding of the nature of things. It's why is it the Trinity? How are you getting there? What's your reasoning for that? Why specifically the Eastern Orthodox Church? How does TAG prove Eastern Orthodoxy?
Right.
Those are all valid concerns and questions.
Right. And I think people recognize that that's where the argument's the weakest. And that's really what I'm saying. The only thing that I wonder about, and this is something that I guess I'm still mulling over, is it worthwhile to even get into the coherence debate? Because I think there's something about arguing about the coherence of the worldviews that still, to me, is not the right frame, right? Why is it that we're going to say the coherency is the determining factor? I'm just not... There's something
And
about that
coherency
just
is
seems
just
off.
vague enough, that they can kind of wiggle their way through, writing that justification of coherency. It's what exactly do you mean by what is coherent, and what are the qualifications for coherent, and when does it become incoherent? And then they have to
Right.
argue for, exactly what you're saying. They have to argue for that and their justifications for using coherency. So yeah, I see what you're saying. It's a little bit of a tricky,
and
hill to die on.
Yeah, what I kind of lean towards is this idea that why aren't we arguing about what's true? If the argument leans towards this thing about coherence, I think the way that they're going to twist it always is going to be towards that vicious and virtuous circularity where they're going to say, well, internally, it all makes sense. And I'm like, who cares?
Yeah.
We should be arguing about truth. And I think that the coherency thing only really works if you're arguing from a skeptical kind of point of view. And so, if you're arguing with an atheist, for example, and you go through the whole epistemology argument and we get to more of a skeptical place where we can say, okay, you're not sure of those things. Well, then we can just lean back on coherence. And it's okay, well, we're not arguing about whether this is true or not. We're arguing about whether it's coherent or not. But those are not the same things. True and coherent are not the same things. But if we're going to say that knowledge exists, which we both do, then why aren't we just talking about truth and what is true rather than what is coherent?
Yeah, it's like you were saying, a fiction can be coherent.
Right.
A story, a movie, the Marvel universe, it can be coherent.
Right.
But is it true? It's a different
That's
concern.
the question.
Yeah, that's what
Right.
we're really getting after. It's we should all be concerned with what is true rather than what is coherent. How can I make this coherent? Because you can make something, you can make a complete falsity that's even vicious, but you can make it coherent.
Sure.
And you can persuade people of it. And, we see this a lot of time with sophists and rhetoricians is they can persuade people make something seem coherent that is completely false. And they use, they employ half truths, and they are relying on the existence of knowledge to kind of, derive some kind of a meaning that they can then twist. So it's like, well, we're not concerned with the twists. We're concerned with the knowledge itself. So, I think that's a great point. We've gone an hour and a half and we haven't looked at your tag argument yet. And I think
that's true.
That's something
we
that we
just
should
get
definitely
into it
do. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wrote a tag argument, and this was kind of tongue in cheek at first, but it started to change my ideas about this, because I've been working on this Substack post for ages. It's like, I don't know how long it is. It's like 20 pages long or whatever. I don't even know if it's going to fit on Substack. But it's about tag, analyzing tag, and then looking at arguments for it. And after doing it, I've had kind of a lot of the realizations we're talking about today. And so I saw somebody posted a sort of summary of Jay Dyer's tag. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to take this and I'm going to Platonize it, essentially. I'm going to write it out as a Platonist argument instead. And this is where I started to really realize, like, oh, there is actually some value to this if this is done properly, I think. So I'll just read it out and we can talk about kind of each one as we go through. So premise number one is: to argue, think, know, predicate, classify, count, or do science, one must presuppose objective intelligibility. Okay. I think so far that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. We've talked about that a lot too.
We talked about that a lot so far. So premise two is that objective intelligibility requires real universals, which are identity, difference, number, truth, logic, essence, relation, and order. Okay. And I'm not listing these off in like any specific order, it's just outlining what this
and
really
there's
means.
more too.
Yeah, there's more to that. Yeah, I'm not saying it's only that or this is exhaustive. Okay. Premise three: real universals cannot be grounded in mutable matter, private mental states, social convention, or arbitrary language. And I think we've seen in these arguments why those fail. That's part of the Theaetetus arguments. That's part of Agrippa's Trilemma. We've kind of covered why those things are not proper grounds for these objects of knowledge we're calling universals. So premise four then is: real universals also cannot be finally grounded in causally inert abstract objects, because such objects cannot explain why reality is ordered by them or why minds can know them. This one we should probably pause for a minute, because we haven't really talked about this a ton, but this was a part of this Christian guy's kind of example for tag. And I can see very clearly what this is doing. This is doing some heavy lifting for them, because up till now, premises 1 through 3, there's nothing in that that's not Platonic. Every single aspect of that is a Platonic argument. And so when we get to 4, it's like they have to interject that, hey, I'm not talking about Platonism.
Yep.
That's basically what this is. Like,
anytime you
think
see
I'm a Platonist,
abstract, they're definitely referring to Platonism, trying to characterize it.
right. So they're trying to make this argument that our belief is that the forms are inert, abstract objects, which obviously is a straw man. That is not what we're saying. So this is one of those, like, this is a true premise, and that's why I included it in mine. I actually agree with you that if they are causally inert abstract objects, if that's what the forms really are, then yeah, we do have a problem on our hands. It doesn't explain why they have an effect on reality, why they order or structure anything, if they're just triangles floating in some other realm or whatever. It doesn't make sense. And it doesn't also make sense why we would have any access to them. Like,
right. Which is, this is kind of a side point, but it just goes to show, because when they wrote that, they thought they just obliterated the Platonic worldview right there. Like, sorry, guys, we just excluded you. And it just goes to show that most people actually don't understand the Platonic argument and the Platonic system. They try to characterize it, and then they are attacking that characterization. So the straw man of it. And it's like, yeah, no, we agree with that. That would be ridiculous. So
yeah, that would be silly.
I bet It's funny because he just thought he dunked on Platonists there, and then to see a Platonist include it.
Yeah, it'd be like, yep, totally agree with you.
Yeah.
I'm on board. Yeah, I mean, it's a good point to make. And to me, I'm using it as a clarification of saying, this is not what Platonists are saying.
Yes.
Right? We disagree for the same reasons you disagree. And yeah, part of the reason why I've decided to get into debate and get into making these arguments and being apologetic in regard to Platonism is that there's so much of that you described, this thing where people make up these straw man arguments about Platonism and then put them out there as though they're absolutely true. Like the one that's still really common, I've seen Jay Dyer do it, but people do it all the time, is this idea that Platonism is substance monism. Yeah.
All is
what we're
one,
saying
man.
is all things are one. And that's not at all what we're saying. You will not find any Platonist that says everything is the one.
Yeah.
You'll never find that. There's not a single Platonist that has ever said that. And so it's stuff like that that drives me nuts. And it's like we keep getting sort of dismissed on our worldview, even though no one's even really aware of it, what the real thing is.
Okay.
Yeah, we were getting into premise 5, I think.
Yeah.
So we agree with them as far as all that goes. So then it says, my premise 5 here is, therefore, universals must be grounded in an eternal, necessary, living intellect whose thinking is their reality, the forms being nothing other than universals understood as the self-luminous content of nous. So obviously this is where I'm starting to interject more of the Platonic understanding, because the first part of this was actually in this Christian guy's argument. He was saying, like, so he's trying to dismiss the idea of universals as inert abstract objects and saying that the only way that it actually makes sense is if these forms or universals are, how does he put it? That they're grounded in an eternal, necessary, living intellect. It's like, that's exactly what nous is. That is exactly what we as Platonists mean by nous. It is the divine mind, right?
Right.
It's also our minds, but it's the divine mind. And that's the correspondence that we have between it.
And you could put it simply too as, universals can only be grounded in a universal mind.
Yes. That's a perfect way to put it, I think. And I just grabbed my Alcanus, my trusty Alcanus. This is one of these things, I'm going to bring it up because it drives me nuts. And I've heard Peter Kreeft, I've heard William Lane Craig, and plenty of other Christians say that Christianity invented the idea that the forms or the universals are thoughts in the mind of God. And they use that to explain why Platonism was a bad system. Like they kind of got it right, but in their world, the forms were just floating in this distant realm that was disconnected from reality, and it didn't make any sense how it relates to our world. You'll hear Jay Dyer say this all the time. It's like, there's no way to connect the realm of the forms to our world. If that's perfect and this is imperfect, how are they connected? It makes no sense. It's totally illogical. He does that whole thing. And I love to point this out because Alcanus wrote in like around 150, and what he wrote was called the Handbook of Platonism. And this was at a time when Platonism was becoming more dogmatic, essentially. Like they were starting to move away from academic skepticism and move into this period of having kind of specified doctrines, right? And this is what he says. This is in 150, okay? He says, oh boy, I should have highlighted this. Of course, it's going to take me a minute to find it. It's basically, he's saying, forms are thoughts in the mind of God.
Right.
Is almost literally what he says in here. And for the forms, here it is. Here's the actual quote. Okay. This is chapter 9, the forms, line 30. For the forms are eternal and perfect thoughts of God. 150, he's writing this. Okay. So there's not a single Christian who'd said anything like that until Augustine. Augustine is
Yeah.
usually the guy that they reference as being the one who had this like Platonic innovation. And all he's doing is parroting a guy from almost 300 years before him who said this. You know, this would be like me thinking that like I came up with the idea of the American Constitution. It makes no sense. Like it's
Right.
total anachronism.
Yeah, and I think there are other earlier Platonists who say something similar, not exactly in that, verbiage, but they say something like the forms are the content of nous.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
that is what is in nous are the forms.
Right.
So it's basically the same thing. It's like, yeah, if nous is the mind of God and the forms are, these intelligibilities, these intelligible objects,
Right.
those are the thoughts of God.
Yeah.
That's
Essentially.
how we would conceive of it. So
Yeah.
nothing unique there.
Nothing unique there. They didn't come up with that one. So I just have to say that because that's always an annoyance of mine. But it goes to show how pervasive this belief is, because this guy put it in his argument just as like, oh yeah, of course. And again, it's like there's not a lot of Platonists out there who are correcting them. So it's really easy for
Right.
them to just say this offhand thing that kind of puts Platonism down or strawmans it. And like, who's going to jump up and be like, nope, that's not actually correct. And here's the proof that you're wrong. So it's good to throw that out there.
Yes, absolutely.
So we covered that part. So then the next premise, premise 6, I get, is the intellect must articulate both unity and plurality because intelligibility requires both sameness and difference, and it must itself proceed from a source beyond predication, since unity that is merely one among many cannot ground unity as such. So this is what I was explaining before about that sameness and difference thing, about how whatever is the cause of sameness and difference can't itself be a being, because that's what we're trying to describe. That's what we're trying to explain, right? And that even if we tried to describe that as merely a sort of, let's see how I get exactly how I put it, that it can't itself just be a one. It can't just merely be one thing either. And that's where I was saying, like, it can't be being itself either, right? So that's
the
really what
infinite
that argument's
regress,
going on.
right? That would be the infinite regress problem if it was just a one among ones.
Yeah, or even like an arbitrary stopping point, because you're just saying that like this one thing exists. You say like, well, what's the cause of that one thing? And they go like, no, it just is. But the
Yeah.
problem is that, and it's a good question to bring up, because somebody could just go like, well, couldn't it just exist? Couldn't being just be? I think S in our group was saying that
Yeah,
a while ago,
yeah.
and we were kind of going into why that doesn't work. But the reason it doesn't work is because being is a particular way, right? It's not obvious that it has to be the way that it is. When we talk about those qualities of sameness and difference, or the laws of logic, the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, that is a qualitative way that being is. Being has that
Yes.
as a quality, right? And so what that means is like there has to be a reason why it is that way and not any other way. Because in theory, it could be something else, or it could just not be at all, right? It exists as it is, and well, it could just as easily not exist. And that right there is what is meant in philosophical arguments for God when we say contingency. So nous, being, and intelligibility are contingent upon these things. They're contingent
Yes.
upon sameness and difference. It's contingent upon their particular quality, right? So if
Right.
it's contingent upon them, well, then you need something to explain why it's one way rather than the other.
Right. There's necessarily something that precedes that.
Right.
Like you could say, and also with the whole like, well, why can't it just be? I mean, you can apply that arbitrarily to anything. It's like, why does it have to be being? Why can't, the sensible world just be what it is? And
Sure.
that's the way it is. That's almost like that kind of Parmenidean take in a way, right? Everything is exactly what it is. So there's built into the idea of being are already preconditions, right?
Yes.
In order for being to be what it is, well, there's a oneness there. There's a unity that's presence. It's not many things, right? It is one being. So you're already pointed upward beyond it.
Yeah. And one of the things I realized is it's part of the reason I got into Platonism and studying theology and philosophy anyways, which was, I used to be an atheist, believe it or not, years ago. And one of the things that stuck in my mind back then, and geez, I'm going like 20 years ago, but one of the things that stuck in my mind was the question, why is there something instead of nothing? And I at that time, I was not philosophically literate at all, but I think I was coming to this realization that like, well, the universe could have not existed, and yet it does.
Yeah.
And like that actually has a ton of meaning to it. When you look at it, you're like, you know, if the atheist position was always like, the universe is just like this cosmic fart that doesn't mean anything. It's just happens, you know. Neil deGrasse Tyson and those guys would be like, the universe doesn't have to explain itself to you. It just they're basically making the argument, it just is, bro.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
That's exactly what they're doing.
And in my mind, it just rattled around my brain. I didn't have an answer to that problem. It was like a little puzzle where I just kept thinking like, well, it could have just not been, but it is. And so that's really one of those like driving things that drove me to ask further questions about why. And it really is that contingency argument in like one question.
Yeah. And just a little thing here, something else that always struck me about the atheist position as being kind of silly is they take all of the laws of the universe for granted, and they'll say, well, it couldn't have been any other way. And it's like, well, why are those laws those way? You're just like, you want us to grant you those laws. Like, well, due to these constraints, it had to be this way. It's like, we're questioning the constraints that made it that way.
What are the constraints? Where do those come from?
Yeah, exactly. And they talk about, you know, the Goldilocks zone. And it's like, well, what is it that made that possible in the first place? So it's a higher order of questioning.
Right. It's a higher order question. Well, and I think that's why you start to see them sort of go into this emergent theory where it's like, oh, it just emerges out of this stuff that happens for no reason. You know, all of these things are just emerging out of matter. You know, consciousness is just springing out of matter. You know, order is coming from the disorder. It's like, it's a very backwards way of thinking, especially if you're a Platonist.
Yeah. And a lot of these guys, funny, it's like atheists, but also a lot of these kind of heathen guys who are anti-Plato. Yeah. They all kind of converge on the same problem, which is this struggle to understand transcendence, which is something we've talked about a lot. Like they just can't conceive of what transcendence actually means when we say that. They think it's just a magical word that we're just using as like a placeholder for something that we can't prove, you know? Right. It's like, no, transcendence has to be a concept in order for anything to actually emerge, you know? Right. So it's,
for anything to cohere, there has to be something that transcends and includes them, essentially.
That's including those constraints, those laws.
Yeah. And they can't be in the things themselves because it's like, no, we're trying to explain how they got in the things. Yes. You know, so it doesn't make any sense to say it that way. Yeah. So premise 7. So after that, we get into this. So if ultimate reality is sheer plurality, that was funny. This is actually exactly what we're talking about. So
okay, cool.
Reality is sheer plurality, unity becomes illusion. If ultimate reality is a unity that excludes plurality, plurality becomes illusion. If ultimate reality is brute and non-noetic, reason and truth are not normative at the root, but accidental to it. So this is really just like an observation more than anything. And we've touched on this in this argument too, that like if we lean towards monism all the way, that all is just one thing, then obviously we have illusion in plurality and just the other way. If you have nothing but particulars, then how do those particulars relate to one another or have any way that they're known to one another? You can't unless there's some overarching unity to them, right? And it's funny. I mean, it's funny that those are like these dominant positions that you see when it seems like it's so obvious that they both are incomplete, that you need kind of both of them. I mean, that is the revelation, I guess, of Platonism, is that we're recognizing that these two things are two sides of the same coin, and you need both of them to actually explain reality.
Yeah, and I think it's easy for people to overlook, even though they're obvious. It's easy for people to overlook that, because if you were to just take kind of like a cursory glance at the world, you'd say, well, of course it's all plurality. I mean, there's a table over there. I'm right here. I'm sitting at another table, and I'm not the table. This table is not that table.
Yeah.
And so they're making all these distinctions, and they're going, well, these are all separate things, yet they're somehow also converging upon, the same reality.
Right.
The same mind. They're not, if things are truly disparate, I don't think people actually realize the implications of actually separate things. It's like, you wouldn't be able to perceive them. You actually
would
would have
completely unknown to one another. Yeah.
Yes. And it's even, it's kind of ironic. It would even be a harder unity in a sense, because everything would be so individually one that they're unrecognizable and unseeable to other things.
Right.
Because the only thing that allows us to see them and to perceive them and to recognize them is there's a shared reality. There's a shared substrate, for lack of a better words, or you might say grounds. There's a shared grounds in which all of these things are being expressed and manifest. So it's a funny thing. Like, I think we just take that for granted. Of course, the table's not me, yet you are sharing an existence. You both share in something, and it's beyond particularity. There's universals at play there. So that's and I'm seeing that being more and more common, which is funny. The whole Heraclitean kind of worldview. I see a lot of guys, like a lot of these kind of other pagan types, are really making this argument with their hard polytheism and everything.
Yeah.
And it definitely has obvious flaws in it and errors. So
I
think it's good to bring that to attention.
Yeah, we could do a whole other.
Yeah,
we could do a whole
it goes
other
beyond the
podcast
scope
on
of
that.
this. Right.
Yeah. So that's number 7. So we get to our last premise here before the conclusion. And this is me being a little tongue in cheek so far. And it's just because I was mirroring one of these Christian arguments. So it's just kind of showing like you could use it in this way. But I say the Neoplatonic order alone grounds unity and plurality eternally without collapsing either. The one beyond being as superessential source, the eternal nous as living self-thinking, in which the forms are articulated as both one and many, and soul as the mediating principle by which intelligibility descends into and ascends from the cosmos, constituting an eternal logos, eternal procession, and eternal rational self-knowledge. So that's pretty close to the conclusion, just drawing all of these different arguments together, showing that like this solves these particular problems, right? Our understanding of the one solves the one and the many problem, if properly understood, which very often it's not properly understood, that the nous as this self-thinking property that thinks the forms helps to understand how we have a nous, a mind, and we're of this same substance of it. And that's how we're able to have knowledge of these things. It orders the universe, and then we're able to commune with it because we're the same thing. We're of the same substance, essentially. So, and then the conclusion from there, I say, therefore, Neoplatonic henology, meaning of the one, not henads, the one nous in the forms as nous's self-luminous content is the only adequate ground for intelligibility, universals, logic, truth, and rational knowledge. So that's me being silly. I don't think I don't think that this means that Platonism is the one and only way to understand the universe necessarily. I think there's other ways that you can put this language, but something like this needs to be true, right?
Yes.
And I think the thing that's beautiful about Platonism versus Christianity in this is that Platonism preserves the metaphysics without theology. And this is something I think you were kind of getting at before, is that like, I used to think that this was a bug, and now I really see it as a feature of Platonism. That's one of its greatest strengths, is that they really avoided, for most of the time, they avoided putting the names of the gods to these different metaphysical principles. They kind of left it alone and just talked about the metaphysical principles as what they are. And the great benefit of that is that we can make this argument and you can apply it to other theological frameworks. Like you might look at this and go like, well, to me, I associate Shiva with the one.
Yes.
Or the nous, right? Might be more accurate. Or, oh, I associate Christ with the Logos, or I associate this with this. Like, it's kind of more of a framework for people than a specific theological, metaphysical mixture that you have to accept. It just gives you the straight logic of it and goes, well, this is how it has to be. Something like this has to exist like this. What you call it or how you worship it or whatever is a totally different question. We're not even getting into that.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, you see, like you were saying, we can do that if we wanted. Like you see Platon do this a lot, where he's like, Zeus is the good itself.
Right.
But I think even he would not say, well, that's true for everyone. Like Zeus is not like the universal God, and Shiva and Odin are therefore, false gods. So it just goes to show the kind of the difference that you're drawing there between theology and metaphysics. And this is really a metaphysical argument, and the theology is a separate thing. So yeah, no, I think that's a great summarization at the end, and it's pretty funny too.
Yeah,
it's kind of like a slap back at this Christian argument that this guy's putting forth, trying to say therefore everyone else is wrong. It's like, look, we can apply that same thing because these are universals. So we can take whatever particular we want, graft it onto it, and just say therefore no one else can do it. We're claiming these universals as our own.
Right. Yeah, you can make that kind of coherency argument and say like, well, it's perfectly coherent. So, but again, we go back to like, okay, maybe it is coherent, but is it true? That's the better question we should be asking.
Right. And I also think in this last premise here, you kind of address the, I guess, the critique or issue that a lot of these anti-Plato guys take with, well, the forms are perfect and we're imperfect. How do the two relate? It shows that there is this continuum, like a gradient, and reason or intelligibility and soul both fulfill that role in a way. There is this like through point, or this through line, that passes through all these different layers. Again, this language isn't very helpful, but
but I mean the core idea is the realm of forms is nous.
Yes.
Right? And that is not separate from us.
Right.
And they treat it like it is. They treat it like, oh, well, that's some separate realm of forms. It's actually called the two worlds theory of Plato.
Yes.
And all of the contemporary Platonic scholars reject this idea. Lloyd Gerson rejects this idea. Eric Pearl rejects it. Jessica Moss. All of these people who talk about Platonism and epistemology and our way of understanding the world and the forms, they're like, no, it's not some separate realm floating out in the ether that we don't have access to. Like, we're in the nous. Nous permeates every aspect. Its being itself is what the nous is. So that's the tie-in between these things. And when we talk about our epistemology, again, it's not this two worlds epistemology where we have to go and reach out and grab something out of this etheric realm of forms, because what we're saying is it's just two distinct objects.
Yes.
But they're everywhere. Like the same way that you're able to hold beliefs, there's this different object of knowledge that you're capable of too. They're different, but they're things that we grasp cognitively, but they're just different objects is all.
And
not that they're separate realms.
Yes, exactly. Not that they're separate things in different places.
Right.
But there is this image that comes to my mind when you were talking about, this kind of J. Dyer critique that he does about the forms, or the one. How does the one relate to the many? How do the forms relate to us who are imperfect? And it makes me think of like taking a photo. If you take a photo of a mountain, that's like saying that, the picture, which is this kind of reflection, that picture has no relevance to that mountain at all. Like the two are completely different.
Right.
The mountain in this case is like the form, and the photo would be, our thought or a proposition or whatever it is.
Right.
It's like, no, the picture
how is the mountain related to the photo? The photo and the mountain are two completely separate things.
Yes.
So how could they possibly be related at all? And it's like, well, one's an image of the other.
Yes,
That's
they're reflections.
It's a reflection,
And that's how we explain this process of emanation, right? It's through reflections that come all the way down, emanated from the good, the perfect, the ineffable. And it is a series that is connected and unified and ordered. And that's why Platonists would call, cosmos means something like order.
Right.
And that was their term for reality, the cosmos. It's order, because that's what it is. So, it's this idea that it's all, distinct and disparate, and these kind of graphs don't really help us there, which we've talked about before. But it's actually much more unified and whole than it's often posited.
We've always talked about those graphs. Like, there's so many Platonic graphs you can get that, show like circles on top of each other of like the Platonic cosmos. And I've always said the best way to understand it is kind of like Russian nesting dolls. It's like concentric circles, one in the next. So it's like everything's in the noose, right? And the soul is in that. And then within the soul is the material world, and like down and down and down, but like they're all in one another. So we're in the noose touches everything. It is the essence of being, essentially. It's the essence of essence. And so you're never disconnected from it.
Right. And it's not like, just a simple image too. The soul is not in the body. The body's in the soul.
Correct.
Like the body is a reflection of the soul. The soul, it's immaterial, so we're not going to see it the same way we see bodies, but it's there.
Right.
And the body's more like a densification of the soul. So it's just a different order, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's part of that like transcendent idea. It's like levels of transcendence, obviously, degrees, that we get into, which, whole other thing too.
And that's what we're saying about knowledge. Like it's the same way. It's all part of this order of varying degrees of, what is more real, what is contingent upon what.
Sure.
And that's it's tricky language, and it leads to a lot of confusion because it is the most difficult subject we could possibly talk about. But I think we'd argue it's also the most admirable, right? The metaphysics, the nature of reality. And
that's why we're talking about it. It's such an interesting topic, and it gets misrepresented so much. Like our position gets misrepresented so much. And part of that is our fault too. I don't think there's a lot of Platonists going out and explaining it in a way that's coherent to people and makes sense. And they go, oh yeah. Like, I think if we get better at explaining it to people, it's actually kind of obvious. And, if they find any truth in these tag arguments and they heard our version of it, I think they go, oh, that actually makes a lot more sense than what these guys are saying over here. Like, I think if you're predisposed to want to look for an argument that proves Christianity, you're not going to buy it anyways. But if you're a more neutral person who's just looking at the argument and curious about it, I think they'd see there's a lot more, there's not a lot more validity to our stance than there is to the typical Christian one.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's hard to argue against that. And hopefully one day we'll see those two worlds come together and see a kind of fleshing out of the more noble argument. I know what my dog in the fight is, but hopefully that's something that you can talk about with like a good spirited, like good faith Christian who actually wants to talk about tag with you.
Sure.
I think the problem is it's like what we're talking about with the whole taking revelation as a given and then, operating off of that basis. That's going to be the difficulty there for them. So they just have to accept that we can start from neutral grounds and ask, well, what's more true, rather than, how can I make my view seem more coherent than your view?
Right. And I think it's going to be hard to navigate, but that's what I'm willing to do. So if there is some ortho bro out there who wants to have the conversation, I'm open to it. I'm open to throwing it out there, because I don't even necessarily think I'm going to be perfect with our argument yet. One of the things the Christians always have going for them is, they have literally schools where this is all they do is talk about apologetics. And like, you can go get trained in Christian apologetics. You can get a 4-year degree in basically like Presup and TAG and learn every possible argument for it. And then there's an avalanche of content online of people who are using the argument and working out particular problems with it. And on our side, it's basically you and me. So like, we don't even have like the big dogs, like the Eric Pearls and the Boyd Gersons and those kind of guys making the argument. Cause like, they're kind of focused on the academy. They write their books and it's to a very niche audience, but like, they're not getting in the fray. They're not getting in the fight with like public debate. And so, that's what we're trying to do. That's what we're really shifting here. And that's why this is of interest to us, is saying, how do we make this argument to the public and to other people that our worldview does actually answer these problems and does it very, very well.
Right. And, we find ourselves in a unique position in this kind of world of Platonism. Like, we're not academics here.
No.
We're religious people. Like, we view Platonism, I would argue, in more of a kind of traditional sense of it being an articulation of a religious worldview. Yeah. And so that's the approach we're coming from. And by coming from that approach, we are saying this is actually something that's feasible for everyday people to understand and have that alternative, route of worship. And we're wanting to present that to them. So it's a different fight for sure than the Gersons and, the Mark Andersons and these type of guys, Eric Pearl and whatnot, which they're very much needed. And we're very much grateful for the work. We're very grateful
for their work. Yes. I wouldn't be able to do any of this without Gerson, Jessica Moss, Eric Pearl. Like, they're where I started putting this together. But I do think it's time for, Platonists to get together and start to actually work out like, hey, what is our best argument and how do we present this to people in a way that is actually effective? And that's really what we're doing at Platonic Path. So, beyond the religious side of what we do, we're also engaging in apologetics and trying to figure out like, hey, how do we do apologetics as Platonists and do it well? So if you're listening to this and you're interested in that, get in touch with us and, we could use your help. Honestly, we could use everybody's help on this. I think it's something where we're not saying we've got it all figured out, but we're working on it and we're getting there.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good place to call it.
Yeah, I think so. All right. Well, good having you on, Ethan. Always good to talk to you about all this stuff. So thanks for joining, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Awesome. Thanks.